We are Citizens Against Wind Turbines in Lake Erie. We call ourselves CAWTILE, if that's an easier way to remember it. If you haven't already seen our Facebook page, I'm sure you already have, otherwise you wouldn't be here. We have 3,500 members from all over the world, but the majority of them are within this region. We're a very diverse group, and it really represents a cross-section, all political affiliations and all demographics. And I think the reason is clear that we all share a love of Lake Erie, and we want to see it kept that way. Pretty much we're united against the proposed at least 50 750 to 1,000 foot tall wind turbines projected to be installed from Buffalo to Dunkirk and Lake Erie, anywhere from 2 to 7 miles away. Sharon talked about the visibility, and there's going to be a lot of discussion as to who can see what when. But if anyone has stood in the Cattaraugus Creek area and looked across the lake, you can see all the wind turbines on the shore. So 2 miles is going to be extremely visible. In terms of the potential environmental impacts, when you have any kind of project that you need to work on, be it in the lake or even in a terrestrial setting, I know from personal experience that you have to typically file an environmental impact statement. And the supposition is that the people who are applying for that permit can show that it won't have any negative impacts. So the burden is on the people who are applying for these wind turbines. And it's not on us. We are opposed to it. So let's keep that clear. When we make statements about what we think is an area of concern, we're not here with the burden to prove that. We're here to bring it up and to make sure that it's examined in future research. The first subject that I think is important with regard to potential environmental impacts is aesthetics. It's the most obvious. Anybody who's driven or biked or walked or boated along or in Lake Erie knows the value of the aesthetics. Obviously, with regard to travel in tourism and that sort of thing, and any travel by auto, boat, fishing, or sightseeing is going to be obviously hurt from that scenario. I've spoken to thousands of people about this, and I have yet to see one person that said that they would find it acceptable to be out on a boat and have to stare at a giant 750-foot wind turbine. In terms of aesthetics, restaurants, resorts, nightclubs, and parks, obviously they're all based on aesthetics, so the view is extremely important. One interesting side note is that NYSERDA, the organization that's been given basically the keys to determine what needs to be researched to determine whether or not we should have wind turbines in Lake Erie, NYSERDA that is. If you didn't hear them say this, you wouldn't believe it. They brought up a subject during one of their webinars where if you did have a problem at your house or your restaurant and you happen to see that there's a wind turbine now out in front of you, just plant a shrub. Really. If I wouldn't have heard it with my own ears, I wouldn't have believed it. Just plant a shrub. So there goes the common sense right out the window. Also, residential properties are obvious. Property value and the quality of life issues associated with spending an incredible amount of money or even a reasonable amount of money on a property and then finding out that without any control or hearsay of your own, these industrial wind turbines might be placed in front of you. In terms of petroleum pollution, we've heard numbers anywhere from 20 to 400 gallons of petroleum would be in the gear case and so forth. There's already bountiful evidence to suggest that they typically leak, and in terrestrial situations it may not be that big of a deal. But in the water, what does it do? Floats. Downstream from these proposed wind turbines is our water intakes. Do the math. I mean, it's pretty obvious that's not something that we want to deal with. But maybe that will present a problem. So there's been a number of studies on the leading edge blades. Turns out that they erode and it allows microplastics to get into the water supply. And in studies in Europe, it's been found actually in human beings, the result directly from the wind turbines, the aquatic wind turbines. So one thing, again, in terrestrial situations where you have microplastics, but in aquatic systems, we all hear about it every day. It's a big deal out on the ocean. Well, it would be a big deal here as well. So I think that needs to be looked into. The decommissioning process, where once they're all done, the wind turbines are considered toxic waste. They have to be actually transported to a toxic waste dump at our expense typically, especially if the system is bankrupt. The taxpayers take on that entire cost. So that, I think, is a problem that needs to be investigated further. If there is a bottom base, there are several different types of wind turbines, and if there is a bottom base to them, then there's another problem. Zebra mussels, since 1990, have completely taken over the benthic or bottom environment in our lake. And on the one hand, they certainly filter a lot. They filter up to 40 liters of water a day, and you can have millions of them in a cubic yard. So if they are concentrating the heavy metals into the sediment, which has been determined, that those heavy metals now that are concentrated down there are being lauded as, wow, that's a good benefit of zebra mussels. If they want to put these wind turbines in a base form like that, they're going to be disturbing those sediments, and thereby disturbing the concentrated now heavy metals. Where are they going to go? Potentially right into our water intakes. In terms of avian issues, avian mortality has been very well documented in wind turbine situations. We recently have seen the reemergence of bald eagle, a lot of shorebirds, and even just seagulls and your typical green heron, great blue heron, and so forth. There's a real concern. There was a real concern when the Peace Bridge was denied. The new Peace Bridge was proposed. And it was denied partly because of terns that was proposed that they would fly into this bridge and kill themselves. So it follows that if they're going to do that, there should be some concern about them flying into the wind turbines themselves. And I think that really is something that needs to be looked at and proven that it wouldn't happen. One of the biggest consumers of insects in the entire shoreline and aquatic area are bats. There is evidence to suggest that bats will also, mortality will increase amongst bats. And anybody who's been out there during August or so on the lake, or September, you've seen monarch butterflies. And you see that they don't come in ones and twos. If you're fishing for an 8-hour time period, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of monarch butterflies. There's some concern about not only the direct mortality of those, but redirecting them and possibly not into the best flight trails. In terms of fish impacts, I could go on for months, but just suffice to say, there's concern about digging the bases into spawning areas. You'll hear wind turbine bases being touted as great habitat, like an artificial reef. That may be true, and there's some evidence to suggest that. But there's also concern about a limited area we have for our now just burgeoning, again, walleye population. And some of the areas 2 miles offshore would be right within that spawning area. And I would suggest that those be researched heavily and documented so that we can show that they would have potentially a negative impact. In terms of the currents that flow around and between each one, it sounds like it's a good area to look at, but there's also a 3,200 no-go zone between each one. Each unit would be located 0.6 miles from one another, and a 3,200 foot no-go zone. My understanding is the 3,200 represents, the 3,200 foot zone represents how far debris will travel when the blades fail. So no-go zone between and amongst, we don't know what the benefits would be if we ever could see a benefit from the base. The redirected currents may affect larval fish and prey species into areas that may not be beneficial or traditional for them in their migration patterns. There may be some that are simply more susceptible, some species of fish that are more susceptible. And Jim Hanley's going to talk a lot more about this. Redistribution of currents and winds has been shown in some European studies to affect the actual temperature, and we've got enough issues going on with the lake being too hot one year and too cold another, and currents and so forth. So that's a concern. Lastly, in terms of environmental impacts, where and exactly how they would bring power cables ashore. We've worked with several municipalities to develop proposals and legislation to assure that through moratorium there would be no construction of these cables going ashore. So if you've seen the whole process, the construction process is pretty devastating, and that would also suspend heavy metals. So in summary, I just wanted to remind you that we are a volunteer organization. How can you help? You can inform others of our meetings. We finally were able to open this up like this, and we intend to move forward with more of these if we can. We do sign rallies. We've typically done some down on Route 5. We always announce them on the Facebook page. You don't need anything to come there. We'll just hand you a sign and hold up the sign. You don't have to interact with anybody. We're just looking for people to recognize the movement. Participate in online webinars. We typically announce the online webinars and open forums. And if you can help distribute these yard signs. And become a 501c3, so we can solicit donations. And then, from that standpoint, we can do work like it. We have tried and are still working on a billboard on Route 5. I could use all the help I could get. We have stickers and flyers for the same purpose. And we're looking for someone possibly to help us incorporate. So all those things will bring more awareness to the whole situation. And of course, if you can attend some of these off-site information type events like Cabela's and environmental shows and meetings. If anything you can do, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you.